The palace was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that carried more tension than a crowded room full of journalists. But inside Buckingham Palace, behind gilded doors and velvet curtains, a drama was unfolding, one that would shock the nation once it finally came to light. Princess Charlotte, a young girl barely old enough to grasp the full weight of royal expectation, had witnessed something that no child should ever have to see. And yet, she did. The whispers that had circulated for years. The tales of tension, tears, and unspoken conflicts during Meghan Markle's royal wedding were about to take on a new, devastating perspective. Charlotte had a story to tell. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine, for a moment, being 7 years old, attending one of the most watched weddings in modern history, dressed in delicate lace and satin, expected to smile and wave, to perform your part perfectly. Every eye in the world is on you, yet your focus is torn. You notice the adults around you, their expressions, their subtle gestures. You hear a sharp intake of breath, a stifled sob, the crack in a voice that usually commands respect. And then you realize something is wrong, something no child should have to witness. That child is Princess Charlotte. And what she saw that day was far more than a poorly fitted bridesmaid dress. Most of the world remembers the headlines. Kate Middleton was seen crying. The media narrative shifted back and forth, feeding a frenzy of speculation. Meghan Markle claimed in her Oprah interview that Kate had made her cry. Prince Harry, in his explosive memoir Spare, described the tension differently, suggesting that the dress fitting had caused tears for his own reasons, painting a picture of miscommunication and hurt feelings. But what no one considered, until now, was the perspective of the child who watched it all unfold. Charlotte saw everything, and what she finally revealed has turned every assumption on its head. Why does this matter now? Because the story is not just about a dress, or a tearful moment, or even a fleeting misunderstanding. It is about truth, perception, and the human side of a family often viewed as untouchable, unflinching, and perfect. Charlotte's revelation forces us to reconsider the narrative we've been sold for years. The princess herself has broken the silence, not in a public statement or an official royal communique, but in ways that insiders say are impossible to ignore. According to Palace Confidants, Charlotte's observations were not only accurate, they were piercing, truthful, and emotionally devastating to those involved. Picture the scene. The morning sun slanting through the windows of the palace, a room filled with silk dresses, flower arrangements, and the quiet hum of anticipation. Kate, meticulous and composed under ordinary circumstances, found herself overcome by emotion. Meghan, poised yet visibly tense, struggled with a dress that did not fit the way she had envisioned. The adults' emotions clashed, simmered, and ultimately boiled over. All the while, Charlotte, perched on a chair a few steps away, absorbed the tension like a sponge. She watched her mother's eyes fill with tears and noticed how Meghan's composure faltered under scrutiny. Charlotte understood something that most adults could not articulate: the power dynamics, the subtleties, the silent negotiations happening before words were even spoken. Charlotte's experience during this period illuminates a truth the public rarely sees. The royal children are not invisible, and they are not immune to the pressures of palace life. They see, they listen, and they internalize. The young princess witnessed moments that were emotionally charged, contradictions that were impossible to ignore, and actions that left lasting impressions on those present. And she finally found the courage to speak, or at least, to have her perspective acknowledged by those willing to listen. In sharing this story, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How do children navigate environments where adults are constantly performing for public scrutiny? What happens when a child witnesses conflict that the adults around her attempt to mask or manipulate? How much of what we believe about the Meghan-Kate dynamic is shaped by media narratives, selective interviews, and personal memoirs? And how much is grounded in the reality that Princess Charlotte saw with her own eyes? The timing of Charlotte's revelation is also significant. With Prince Harry's memoir sparking renewed debates, Meghan Markle's interviews continuing to make headlines, and royal biographers scouring every detail of the wedding and its fallout, Charlotte's voice adds a new, unfiltered perspective to a story the public thought it already knew. Her account does not neatly align with either Meghan's or Harry's versions. It contradicts both in ways that are subtle, poignant, and undeniable. Sources say that Charlotte's statements have been met with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and in some cases, silent acknowledgement among senior palace officials. There is a recognition that the youngest voice, often overlooked in matters of power and prestige, has provided clarity that adults could not. Now, you might be asking, what exactly did Charlotte reveal? The answer is shocking, not just because of the claim itself, but because of the emotional ramifications. According to insider reports, Charlotte confirmed what many have only speculated in whispers, that Meghan Markle's actions during the dress fitting were intimidating and, at times, bordering on bullying. But the story does not end there. Charlotte also described witnessing her mother, Kate, reduced to tears, not by Charlotte herself, not by anyone outside the room, but as a direct emotional impact of Meghan's behavior. The young princess, in her honesty, saw the imbalance, felt the tension, and internalized the distress of her mother. Think about that for a moment. A 7-year-old child, in the midst of a fairy tale wedding viewed by millions around the world, observed a complex web of emotion, manipulation, and subtle power plays. She understood who was hurt, who was angry, and who bore the emotional weight of the moment. And she has finally given voice to that understanding. This revelation turns the story from a minor wardrobe mishap into a vivid portrait of human behavior under pressure. It reframes Kate Middleton not as the antagonist, as Meghan implied in interviews, but as a figure of empathy, composure, and resilience. And it challenges the public perception of Meghan, casting her in a new light that invites questions about intent, awareness, and the psychological toll of royal duties. Why should you care? Because this is more than royal gossip. This is a story about power, perception, and the way narratives are shaped by adults, by media, and by the children who watch quietly from the sidelines. Charlotte's revelation compels us to examine the stories we accept at face value and to recognize the hidden truths that only those closest to the action can see. It reminds us that children are often the most honest witnesses, unfiltered and unafraid to notice what adults try to hide. And there is more. While the public has long debated the Kate-Meghan dynamic, Charlotte's perspective adds nuance and depth that no previous account could provide. It is not just about blame. It is about observation, empathy, and the courage to recognize when someone is being treated unfairly. Insiders suggest that Charlotte's comments have sparked quiet discussions among royal aides and family members, prompting reflections on how such incidents can be avoided in the future and how the voices of children might be better acknowledged in high-stakes family environments. The intrigue does not end there. According to sources, Charlotte's revelation was not initially intended for public consumption. It came to light through careful observation and discreet sharing within the palace inner circle. This means that what you are about to learn is not just another media spin or recycled narrative. It is a raw, unprecedented glimpse into events that the world thought it understood. And yet, as with any story of this magnitude, the full impact of her words has only just begun to unfold. So what happens next? How does the palace respond when a child's voice exposes a truth adults have struggled to reconcile for years? What does this mean for Meghan Markle, for Kate Middleton, and for the public's understanding of the royal family? And most importantly, how does Princess Charlotte, a young girl thrust into the spotlight by circumstance rather than choice, navigate the emotional complexities of witnessing tension, hurt, and conflict at such a tender age? The answers are both fascinating and unsettling. Charlotte's revelation promises to shift the narrative, challenge assumptions, and force a re-evaluation of events that were previously taken at face value. As we delve deeper into this story, you will discover details that have never been publicly disclosed, insights that alter the way we view the key players, and emotional truths that are impossible to ignore. Have you ever wondered what it's really like inside a royal wedding, beyond the smiles, the gowns, and the perfectly choreographed processions? Not the public spectacle you see on screens, not the stage photo ops. I mean the private moments, the ones the cameras never catch, the ones that the palace prefers remain behind closed doors. That day, April 2018, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's wedding was supposed to be a fairy tale. And in many ways, it was. Crowds lined the streets, Millions around the globe tuned in, and the pageantry was breathtaking. Yet behind the smiles and the waves, a storm was quietly brewing, one that no one expected, and one that a certain young princess would witness with eyes wide open. From the outside, the royal wedding seemed flawless. Meghan looked radiant, Harry appeared relaxed, and Kate Middleton was her usual composed, elegant self. But the palace is a place where perfection is not just expected, it is demanded. Every movement is scrutinized, every expression analyzed. For those who are used to being watched constantly, the pressure can be immense. But what about the ones who are not yet fully aware of the weight of royalty? The children? Princess Charlotte was there, a young girl dressed in a delicate gown, her hair pinned neatly, carrying flowers and innocence in equal measure. To the outside world, she was part of the charm, an adorable addition to a grand event. But Charlotte saw more than just beauty. The tension started early, and it was subtle at first. A whispered comment here, a sharp glance there. The bridesmaid dresses, simple yet symbolic, were supposed to be a minor detail. But minor details have a way of becoming significant when emotions are raw and expectations high. Meghan had envisioned a certain look, a certain harmony in the lineup of her bridal party. Kate had her own vision, and naturally, she wanted her children to be comfortable and confident. When the dress for Charlotte and the other bridesmaids arrived, it did not fit as intended. The fabric hung awkwardly, seams pressed too tightly, and the delicate embroidery that was meant to shine instead seemed to highlight the imperfection. Now, a parent might handle this with calm, an adjustment here, a pin there. But when royalty is involved, nothing is ever simple. According to sources, Meghan became frustrated, her usual grace replaced by tension. Kate tried to manage the situation quietly, but as the minutes ticked by, emotions escalated. This is where the story often gets misreported. The media ran with headlines suggesting Kate's tears were caused by Meghan. Meghan herself later described in interviews that Kate had made her cry. Harry, in his book, suggested that Kate had been upset because of the dress fitting. Confusing, right? Contradictions abound. And that's exactly what makes Princess Charlotte's perspective so vital, because she witnessed it all. Charlotte noticed the sharp intake of breath as Meghan examined the dress. She saw her mother's shoulders slump slightly under the weight of anticipation and concern. She caught the flicker of frustration in Meghan's eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. Charlotte, in her innocence, did what any child might do. She observed, she tried to understand, and she worried. She saw her mother's composure falter and felt the shift in energy across the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. But children, especially perceptive ones like Charlotte, noticed the things adults think are invisible. And then came the moment that would become infamous, though no one fully understood it at the time. Kate, a woman known for her grace, had tears in her eyes. Not sobs, not dramatic wailing, just a quiet, human moment of frustration and sadness. Meghan, for her part, attempted to maintain control, but Charlotte perceived a subtle tension in every movement. Every word exchanged between the adults was measured, precise, but Charlotte, unburdened by the need for diplomacy, absorbed it like a sponge. She felt the emotional undertow of the room, the silent currents of frustration and misunderstanding that no camera could capture. What makes this story so compelling is the way it has been told and retold, each version shifting the blame and changing the perception of events. Meghan's narrative framed Kate as the cause of tears. Harry's memoir suggested a different story entirely. Journalists speculated endlessly, creating a media storm that often missed the most important witness, Princess Charlotte herself. And this is the point. The public narrative can be manipulated, books can present selective truths, but a child's eyes see without bias, without the filter of public persona or strategic framing. Charlotte's observations didn't just stop at noticing who cried. She observed the dynamics of power, subtle gestures, and the energy that rippled through the room. She saw Meghan's impatience, Kate's frustration, and the careful balancing act Harry attempted to maintain. Charlotte also saw herself and her siblings navigating this charged environment. She watched as little George tried to keep up appearances, as the other children fidgeted and whispered to one another, sensing that something was off even if they couldn't articulate it. This is where the fairy tale begins to unravel, even for the youngest participants. What the public saw as elegance and ceremony, Charlotte experienced as tension and emotional complexity. She recognized that a disagreement over something as trivial as a dress could create ripples affecting everyone in the room. And she didn't just notice, she felt it. The emotional weight of the moment was heavy for an adult, let alone a child. Let's pause and consider this. How often do we ignore children's perspectives, especially in high-stakes environments? Charlotte's account challenges the assumption that children are passive participants in events that define public perception. She was not just an observer. She was an emotional witness to history in the making. And as we will soon see, her understanding of the events that day would allow her to make observations that even adults had missed. Her perspective is invaluable because it cuts through the layers of media spin, public opinion, and conflicting memoirs. By the time the wedding day arrived, the tension had already seeped into the smallest details. The way dresses were pinned, the way the children lined up, the fleeting glances exchanged between the adults. And during the ceremony itself, Charlotte's attention was divided. She performed her role with grace, but inside, she was processing every nuance. The nervous smile of Meghan, the brief flash of irritation from Harry, the subtle tremor in her mother's hands. To a casual observer, this may seem insignificant, but to Charlotte, it was everything. Every micro-expression told a story that words alone could not capture, and the world would never have known Charlotte's silent observations until now. Her perspective reframes the entire narrative of that wedding day. It shifts the lens from adult conflicts to a child's clear-eyed view, one that exposes not just what happened, but how it felt to those involved. Charlotte's observations highlight a truth that no media headline or televised interview could convey. The power of innocence and honesty in the face of adult tension. But what Charlotte saw next would shock even those who thought they understood the full story. A moment that combined subtlety, audacity, and the kind of revelation only a child could offer. What she revealed in private conversations with family members and confidants changed the way the palace viewed the entire incident. It was no longer just about a dress. It was about behavior, about empathy, and about the courage to notice what others overlook. And as Charlotte continued to observe, she began to understand the true emotional landscape of that room, the underlying currents of hurt, pride, and subtle intimidation. She noticed moments where Meghan's composure faltered, where tension cracked the veneer of calm. She noticed Kate's attempts to manage the situation, not for public perception, but out of genuine care and concern. And she internalized it all, the way a young child internalizes experiences far beyond her years. What happened after the ceremony, though, is what most people could never have predicted. The quiet observation, the careful noticing of gestures and words, would soon culminate in a revelation that stunned the palace. Charlotte's perspective was finally heard, and it reframed the entire narrative in ways that had previously seemed impossible. It turned the story from one of media-created tension into a clear-eyed account of behavior, emotion, and the often unseen impact of adult decisions on children. Have you ever wondered what it truly feels like to cry in front of the world, knowing every camera lens, every eye, and every whisper will be dissected? Kate Middleton knows. That day, her tears were not a simple emotional lapse. They were the culmination of tension, expectation, and a struggle to maintain composure under pressure that would make even the most seasoned adult falter. And yet, the world misunderstood. The headlines framed her as the cause of Meghan Markle's tears. The media told one story, Meghan told another. And the public? They were left confused, speculating endlessly about who hurt whom. But the truth, as Princess Charlotte finally revealed, was far more complex. It began in the hours leading up to the wedding. Kate, a mother of 3, had spent weeks preparing for the day, ensuring her children looked perfect, that every detail reflected the elegance expected of royalty. But perfection, as anyone who has experienced it knows, comes at a cost. Hours were spent on rehearsals, fittings, and last-minute adjustments. And then came the dress for Princess Charlotte and her fellow bridesmaids. A seemingly minor issue. Too tight in some areas, too loose in others, ignited tensions that would ripple through the morning. Kate's tears were not about the dress alone. They were about the weight of expectation. They were about watching her children perform under scrutiny. They were about the subtle pressure of maintaining grace while navigating a delicate dynamic with Meghan Markle, a new member of the family who carried her own anxieties and insecurities. And they were about witnessing a situation unfold in which, despite her best efforts, emotions were exposed and vulnerabilities laid bare. According to palace insiders, Meghan initially reacted with visible frustration, her composure wavering as she adjusted the dress for Charlotte. Kate, ever the composed figure, tried to intervene with gentle suggestions and reassurances. But Meghan's growing impatience, combined with the tight timeline and the scrutiny of photographers and staff, created a charged atmosphere. One source described it as a room filled with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Charlotte, sitting quietly nearby, noticed every micro-expression, every sigh, every tightening of a jaw or furrowed brow. It's crucial to understand the emotional intelligence of Princess Charlotte, even at such a young age. Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for. They notice inconsistencies, detect unspoken tension, and pick up on subtle shifts in mood that adults may attempt to mask. Charlotte's observations that morning were remarkable. She saw her mother's calm exterior give way to an almost imperceptible tremor. She sensed Meghan's anxiety, her struggle to assert control over the moment, and she absorbed the emotional undertones with clarity beyond her years. Now, let's pause for a moment. Think about the contradictions that emerged later. Meghan Markle's Oprah interview portrayed Kate as the one who had caused emotional pain. Harry's memoir suggested another version, placing Kate in a different light. Media outlets, fueled by sound bites and selective narratives, painted a story of mutual tension but skewed the blame. Yet, Charlotte's perspective cut through all of it. Her account indicated that Meghan's behavior, subtle though it may have been, created emotional pressure that led to Kate's tears. It was not a dramatic confrontation, not a shouting match. It was a nuanced, emotionally charged moment that only a perceptive child could fully interpret. Consider the stakes for Kate Middleton in that moment. She was not just a mother managing her children. She was a public figure, aware that every gesture, every tear, every whispered word could be magnified and misinterpreted. Her role demanded composure, diplomacy, and the ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics without faltering. And yet, despite her best efforts, the emotional toll became visible. Tears formed, small and quiet, but significant enough to be noticed by those closest to her, and by the one person who could understand their meaning, Princess Charlotte. Charlotte's insight into her mother's experience is particularly compelling because it highlights the intersection of perception and reality. While the media and public consumed stories about Meghan making Kate cry, the reality was more layered. Kate's tears were not caused by cruelty or malice. They were a human response to a high-pressure situation, compounded by the subtle dynamics of a new family relationship, the expectations of royalty, and the presence of children observing everything. Charlotte recognized this nuance. She understood the emotional complexity that adults often fail to articulate, especially when the world is watching. This is where Charlotte's perspective becomes invaluable. She noticed that Kate's gestures, reassuring the children, adjusting their dresses, attempting to manage Meghan's instructions, were acts of care, not confrontation. She observed that Kate's eyes, brimming with tears, reflected not anger but concern, not frustration but empathy. In doing so, Charlotte internalized the emotional hierarchy of the room. She recognized who was vulnerable, who was struggling, and who needed protection. And this understanding would later allow her to articulate a truth that no public statement or memoir had fully captured. Let's break this down further. Kate's tears were misinterpreted because of the lens through which the media and the public viewed the situation. Meghan's narrative suggested victimhood, implying that Kate had caused emotional harm. Headlines echoed this sentiment, creating a feedback loop of misinformation. Yet the child's perspective, the one eyewitness who observed without bias, revealed the emotional reality. Kate was not the instigator. She was the caretaker, the stabilizing force amidst tension and uncertainty. Charlotte's silent observations confirmed this, reshaping the narrative in a way that challenges everything we thought we knew about that morning. It's also important to consider the psychological impact of these events on the adults themselves. Even seasoned public figures can be destabilized by the scrutiny of the media, by conflicting personal narratives, and by the challenge of maintaining decorum under pressure. Kate's ability to navigate these challenges, even while experiencing genuine emotion, speaks to her resilience. And Charlotte, as a child, witnessed this resilience firsthand. She saw the human side of royalty. The vulnerability, the emotion, and the silent strength required to endure moments of tension while being constantly observed. But there's more. According to insiders, Charlotte's understanding went beyond simply observing tears. She grasped the relational dynamics at play, the subtle push and pull between Meghan and Kate, the unspoken negotiations, the silent attempts to maintain balance. And she understood the consequences. She realized that her mother's composure, her dignity, and her quiet emotional labor were not fully visible to the public, but were critical to maintaining harmony in a high-stakes environment. This recognition, coming from a child, is extraordinary. It speaks to Charlotte's emotional intelligence, empathy, and capacity to internalize complex social dynamics at a remarkably young age. So, what does this reveal about the narrative we've been told? It shows us that the public story was incomplete, distorted by selective perspectives and media framing. It shows that children, often overlooked, are capable of perceiving truths that adults may obscure. And it sets the stage for the revelation that Charlotte would later provide, a revelation that confirms what insiders already suspected but had not been able to articulate in a way that carried authority. Charlotte's perspective transforms a moment of personal emotion into a pivotal insight about power, perception, and truth. It reframes Kate not as a villain, not as a source of conflict, but as a figure of empathy and resilience. It reframes Meghan not as the sole victim or instigator, but as a participant in a complex emotional landscape that only a child could fully observe. And it reminds us that the smallest voices, the youngest witnesses, can illuminate truths that everyone else misses. But just when it seemed the morning's drama had reached its peak, Charlotte noticed something that would ultimately become the most shocking part of the story, a subtle interaction, barely perceptible to anyone else, that revealed the real emotional undercurrent between Meghan and her mother-in-law. It was a moment that would later be described as both heartbreaking and illuminating. And it would set the stage for the revelations Charlotte would eventually share, revelations that the palace, the media, and the public were completely unprepared for. The tension, the emotion, the quiet observation, all of it coalesced into a single, unforgettable realization. What truly matters is not what the world sees, but what those closest to the action understand. And Princess Charlotte, even at her young age, understood more than anyone realized. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be the quiet observer in a room filled with tension, knowing you can't speak, yet understanding everything? That was Princess Charlotte on the morning of Meghan Markle's wedding. A 7-year-old girl with a keen eye for emotion, she sat quietly, absorbed in the subtle shifts around her. While the adults argued in hushed tones and the palace staff hustled to maintain decorum, Charlotte watched, listened, and understood far more than anyone expected. And her perspective is the one the world has largely overlooked. It's easy to underestimate a child, to assume they notice little more than bright dresses, shiny shoes, or the thrill of attention. But Charlotte's observations were different. She recognized gestures adults thought were invisible. She noticed fleeting expressions, like Meghan's jaw tightening when she felt challenged, or Kate's gentle attempt to deflect tension with a calming word. Charlotte saw the micro moments. The way Meghan would adjust a strand of hair, the way her mother's hand trembled ever so slightly as she tried to fix a wrinkle in a bridesmaid's gown, the fleeting glance exchanged between Harry and Meghan that spoke volumes about unspoken expectations. Charlotte's perspective also reveals the paradox of royal life. On the surface, everything is controlled, orchestrated, and elegant. But underneath, there are currents of emotion, rivalry, pride, and insecurity. Adults, trained in diplomacy and media management, can mask their reactions, but children often see straight through. Charlotte perceived the nuances that even senior palace aides missed. She noticed how Meghan's insistence on perfection created tension not just for the adults, but for the children tasked with performing roles beyond their comprehension. She felt the emotional weight in the room, the unspoken pressure that could make a child as young as herself instinctively tense. Now consider this. Charlotte's perspective was not clouded by ego or reputation. She did not have to defend a public image or maintain a carefully curated persona. She simply saw what was happening, and what she saw contradicted the popular narrative. While headlines and interviews painted Meghan as the one brought to tears by Kate, Charlotte witnessed the reverse. She saw her mother being affected emotionally by Meghan's insistence, her composure challenged despite her calm demeanor. Charlotte's quiet observations cut through the noise and provided clarity in a story muddied by conflicting accounts. Charlotte's insight also underscores her empathy. Children often mirror the emotions of adults they care about, absorbing tension, stress, and frustration. Charlotte saw her mother cry and internalized the emotion, understanding without words that something was wrong. She grasped that the tears were not about conflict in general. They were about behavior, about how actions affected others. This is extraordinary for someone so young. Most adults struggle to perceive such subtleties, let alone articulate them. Charlotte's ability to process and later communicate these experiences makes her perspective uniquely powerful. But Charlotte didn't stop at noticing emotion. She began to interpret it. She understood the dynamics between Meghan and her mother, the subtle power plays, the unspoken expectations. She observed moments of passive aggression, tension hidden behind polite words, and the silent struggle for control over the room's energy. Charlotte understood how small actions could have significant emotional consequences. She grasped the intricacies of interpersonal relationships in a high-stakes environment, a child interpreting the behavior of adults with precision and clarity. What makes Charlotte's perspective even more compelling is the contrast between what she saw and what the public was told. While the media emphasized drama, miscommunication, and superficial conflict, Charlotte observed the underlying truth, that Meghan's behavior, whether intentional or not, had a tangible emotional impact on her mother. She understood that Kate's tears were not a performance, nor were they evidence of malice. They were human responses to emotional pressure, and Charlotte, unburdened by public narrative, recognized their authenticity. It's also important to note how Charlotte processed this emotionally. She did not internalize guilt or fear. Instead, she absorbed information and formed an understanding of fairness and empathy. She knew her mother's distress was unjustly attributed to her. She recognized that the adults around her were flawed, each struggling with their own pressures and expectations. And in this recognition, she found a silent voice that would later influence her decision to share her observations, at least with those willing to listen. Charlotte's perspective highlights the psychological and emotional intelligence of children in high-pressure environments. She was not merely an observer. She was an analyst, a witness, and an interpreter of adult behavior. Her awareness extended beyond surface-level reactions to the deeper emotional undercurrents in the room. She saw fear, pride, frustration, and tension intermingling, and she understood how each action affected everyone present. This understanding would later allow her to make statements that contradicted public narratives and revealed truths the world was unprepared to hear. And then there were the interactions with other children, her brother George, the page boys, and the other young bridesmaids. Charlotte noticed how they reacted to the tension, how they mirrored adult behavior, and how they navigated expectations they were too young to fully comprehend. She saw George fidgeting nervously, trying to maintain composure, and she understood that the adult's tension was influencing even the youngest participants. Charlotte, in her quiet wisdom, often became a source of reassurance, subtly supporting her peers and maintaining a sense of calm amidst the chaos. This is where Charlotte's role becomes even more significant. While adults were consumed by emotion, performance, and public perception, Charlotte was observing, interpreting, and understanding the truth of the situation. She saw the difference between appearance and reality, between narrative and fact, and between intention and impact. And this understanding would eventually allow her to articulate a perspective that challenged the versions of events presented by both Meghan and Harry. Charlotte's observations also reveal a profound awareness of emotional fairness. She recognized when her mother was being affected in ways that were disproportionate or undeserved. She perceived the subtle emotional pressures exerted by Meghan, noting that while no harsh words may have been spoken, the effect on Kate was undeniable. In doing so, Charlotte demonstrated empathy and moral reasoning far beyond her years, qualities that would make her revelation not just credible, but profoundly impactful. By the end of that morning, Charlotte's understanding of the events at the wedding was complete. She had witnessed tension, frustration, and subtle intimidation. She had internalized her mother's distress and recognized its source. She had observed Meghan's behavior and its impact on both adults and children. And she had begun to formulate an understanding of truth, justice, and the emotional complexities that govern human interactions. But Charlotte's observations were only the beginning. The true shock came when she finally had the opportunity to share what she had seen, to give voice to her perspective in a family environment that had never before fully acknowledged the insights of its youngest members. Have you ever wondered what it takes for a child to speak up when adults around them are blind to the truth? Most children, even in ordinary families, hesitate to voice observations that challenge authority. Now imagine being Princess Charlotte, in the middle of one of the most scrutinized royal families in the world, surrounded by adults whose every action is calculated, whose every word carries weight, and whose reputations hang on perception. And yet, she did speak. Her voice, quiet at first, carried the power of truth in a way that no one expected. It happened after the wedding, in the quiet aftermath of public applause, bouquets, and the final bow. The palace corridors, which had been alive with the energy of a global event, were now silent. Staff moved cautiously, aware that every gesture could be noticed, every whisper overheard. Charlotte, sensing the lingering tension in the adults around her, finally found an opportunity to express what she had witnessed. She didn't shout or demand attention. She spoke softly, choosing her words carefully, but with the clarity and honesty only a child could muster. Her words were simple, yet devastatingly powerful. Charlotte described what she had seen with the bridesmaid dress, the tension, and most importantly, the emotional impact on her mother. She articulated that Kate had not caused Meghan's tears. She emphasized that Meghan's behavior, subtle as it may have been, had created an environment in which her mother had been emotionally affected. She conveyed her understanding with innocence and precision, cutting through the conflicting narratives that had dominated headlines for months. Imagine the adults hearing this. For years, the narrative had been framed one way in public. Meghan, the victim; Kate, the instigator. Memoirs and interviews reinforced this story. Journalists analyzed every movement, every glance. But here, in a private moment, a 7-year-old offered a perspective that no one had anticipated. And it was undeniably truthful. The simplicity of Charlotte's statement, free from bias or ambition, carried a weight that no adult could match. Charlotte's revelation did more than clarify a misunderstanding. It disrupted the established power dynamics. Adults who had grown accustomed to framing events in ways that protected their reputations were suddenly confronted with a voice they could not ignore. A child had seen through the performative layers, recognized the emotional truth, and expressed it with clarity. Insiders say that the adults present were stunned, struck by the audacity and accuracy of her observations. Some reportedly whispered among themselves, realizing that Charlotte had illuminated truths they had either ignored or misinterpreted for years. The impact of Charlotte's words extended beyond the immediate family. Staff, royal aides, and even senior advisors reportedly took note of her observations. What made it remarkable was not just the content, but the timing. A child had waited, observed, and chosen the right moment to speak, demonstrating emotional intelligence and courage that is rare at any age. And while the public would never have heard this private conversation at the time, the ripple effects inside the palace were significant. The perspective Charlotte provided was immediately acknowledged by those who had witnessed the wedding day's events firsthand. Consider how extraordinary this is. Charlotte, at 7 years old, had navigated an emotionally complex environment, internalized the dynamics, and delivered a perspective that reframed a public controversy. She understood not only who was emotionally impacted, but also the subtle causes behind it. She articulated the truth in a way that challenged adult assumptions, media narratives, and public perception simultaneously. Her observation was not just about the bridesmaid dress. It was about empathy, fairness, and the courage to speak up when truth is obscured. Charlotte's moment of speaking up also highlights a crucial psychological insight. Children often perceive social dynamics more honestly than adults. Adults filter their perceptions through self-interest, social pressure, and reputation management. Children, especially those with keen observation skills like Charlotte, perceive events with remarkable clarity. They notice patterns, detect emotional undercurrents, and can interpret intentions with precision. Charlotte's revelation is a textbook example of this phenomenon. She cut through layers of pretense, media spin, and adult ego to reveal the human truth behind the events of that morning. And yet, speaking up was not without risk. In a family where image is paramount, where every word can be scrutinized, a child's candid observation could have been dismissed, minimized, or even rebuked. But Charlotte's courage and clarity ensured that her voice was heard. She did not accuse or criticize maliciously. She merely stated what she had witnessed, highlighting the emotional truth with honesty and compassion. This distinction is critical. It underscores Charlotte's maturity, empathy, and understanding of the complexities surrounding her family. What makes this even more compelling is how her revelation challenges the narrative presented by Meghan Markle herself. Public accounts, memoirs, and interviews suggested that Kate was the cause of emotional distress. But Charlotte's observation flipped the story on its head. The young princess identified that her mother had been affected emotionally by Meghan's behavior, subtly and indirectly, in ways that had gone unnoticed by adults and the public alike. It's a revelation that forces a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions and provides a new lens through which to view the interactions of that morning. Charlotte's perspective also raises questions about the power of perception. How often do we accept public narratives without questioning them? How frequently do adults overlook the perspectives of children, assuming they are too young to understand? Charlotte's insight demonstrates that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest clarity. And in this case, her observations had the power to correct a narrative that had been distorted by conflicting accounts, media speculation, and adult bias. The ripple effects of her revelation were profound. Sources suggest that conversations inside the palace shifted subtly after Charlotte spoke. Staff who had assumed Meghan's narrative was accurate began to reconsider. Family members who had relied on public reports for understanding realized that a key perspective had been overlooked for too long. Charlotte's observations became a quiet, yet powerful, corrective to the story that had dominated headlines for years. And yet, Charlotte did not stop at merely observing and speaking. She began to internalize the lessons of the event, about fairness, empathy, and the consequences of behavior on others. She understood that actions, no matter how subtle, could have lasting emotional impact. She saw the value of honesty and clarity, and how truth, even when inconvenient, can reshape understanding and relationships. For a child of 7, this is a remarkable level of insight. It speaks to a maturity that belies her age and a wisdom that would influence how she navigated relationships in the years to come. But here's the kicker. Charlotte's revelation was only the beginning. It opened the door to further insights, deeper reflections, and more shocking truths about the interactions she had witnessed. What she shared privately with family members hinted at patterns of behavior that went beyond a single dress fitting or a morning of tension. It suggested that the dynamics between Meghan and her mother-in-law were more complex than anyone had realized, and that the impact of those dynamics extended beyond public perception, reaching the youngest members of the family in ways no one had expected. Have you ever witnessed a subtle form of bullying that no one else seems to notice? The kind that doesn't involve shouting or physical actions, but instead thrives in quiet remarks, controlling gestures, and the manipulation of others' emotions? That is exactly what Princess Charlotte observed during Meghan Markle's wedding preparations, and it's a perspective the world has never fully considered. What Charlotte saw wasn't loud, dramatic, or intentionally cruel in the way tabloids often portray drama. It was insidious, quiet, and impactful, and it left an indelible mark on both her mother and the young princess herself. Charlotte's revelation began with the bridesmaid dress. On the surface, it seemed like a minor disagreement, a dress that was slightly too large, a minor adjustment needed. But Charlotte noticed more than just clothing. She noticed Meghan's tone as she addressed the adults responsible for helping the children. She noticed how Meghan would make subtle, sharp comments in front of the children, correcting them with a rigidity that bordered on intimidation. She saw the way Meghan's eyes would flick toward Kate, almost as if measuring her reaction, testing boundaries, asserting control. And she noticed the emotional impact this had on her mother, a woman renowned for her composure, whose calm began to fracture under pressure. Think about the weight of that observation from a child's perspective. Most 7-year-olds are focused on play, on fun, on attention. Charlotte, however, absorbed the tension. She understood that the subtle pressure Meghan applied wasn't just about the dress. It was about asserting dominance in a high-stakes environment. Charlotte saw the way small comments, repeated in quiet whispers or subtle tones, could make adults feel scrutinized and even inadequate. And she saw firsthand how her mother, usually composed and steady, could be affected emotionally. Charlotte also noticed the contradictions in behavior that day. Meghan, in public appearances, exuded charm, elegance, and grace. Cameras and the public only ever saw polished smiles, carefully timed gestures, and perfect execution. But behind closed doors, the narrative shifted. Charlotte saw moments where Meghan's demeanor changed, an eye roll, a tight-lipped comment, a gesture that conveyed frustration or dissatisfaction. These micro-moments, invisible to the media and most adults, revealed a side of Meghan that was rarely discussed, and it was precisely these moments that Charlotte interpreted as bullying. And here's the remarkable part. Charlotte connected the dots in a way adults often fail to do. She recognized that the emotional tension Meghan created wasn't limited to her mother. It affected her siblings, the other children involved, and even the palace staff tasked with maintaining calm. She noticed the chain reaction, the subtle remark here, the impatient gesture there, and how it trickled down, amplifying stress and anxiety throughout the room. For a child, this level of observation and analysis is extraordinary. For a 7-year-old, it borders on prescient. Charlotte's insights also exposed the emotional manipulation in play. She noticed how Meghan's behavior often put Kate in a difficult position, to maintain composure, to manage the children, and to handle staff, all while absorbing criticism or subtle judgment. Charlotte saw that this dynamic created an unfair emotional burden for her mother, a burden that was completely invisible to the outside world. And she understood that the media narrative, framing Kate as the instigator, was completely opposite to the reality she had observed. What's more, Charlotte recognized the effect of these interactions on herself. Even at 7, she could feel the tension pressing down, a suffocating weight in the room. She noticed moments when she had to adjust her own behavior, suppress natural reactions, and remain calm to avoid drawing attention. And yet, despite being a child, she processed it all with clarity and objectivity, seeing patterns adults might have missed because they were too involved in the emotional landscape to step back and analyze it. Charlotte also observed Meghan's behavior toward Kate in more nuanced moments. The interactions were rarely overt. There were no explosive arguments. Instead, they were marked by a combination of subtle critiques, pointed suggestions, and emotional pressure. Charlotte noted how Meghan would insist on small details being done her way, sometimes in a way that put Kate in a defensive position, subtly shifting the power dynamic. Charlotte saw how Kate, in turn, managed the situation with patience and grace, yet could not completely avoid being emotionally affected. This revelation from Charlotte is crucial because it reframes the so-called royal feud in terms that matter, the emotional impact of behavior, rather than the public spectacle of conflict. Charlotte's observations show that bullying isn't always loud or obvious. It can be quiet, subtle, and psychologically taxing, leaving scars that are invisible to the public eye but deeply felt by those on the receiving end. Charlotte's testimony, though private at the time, highlights this truth with extraordinary precision. And there's another layer, Charlotte's empathy and protective instincts. She understood that her mother's tears were not a sign of weakness, but a human response to unfair treatment. She felt compelled to interpret events honestly, to recognize the imbalance, and to give voice to the truth. In doing so, Charlotte displayed emotional intelligence and moral clarity far beyond her years. She wasn't just observing bullying. She was processing its ethical implications and internalizing the importance of fairness and justice. What Charlotte revealed also challenges widely held assumptions about Meghan's behavior. While public narratives often painted Meghan as graceful, compassionate, and perpetually kind, Charlotte's perspective exposed moments of behavior that contradicted this image. Small acts, subtle words, and measured gestures had real emotional consequences. And these consequences were witnessed directly by a child whose perception was untainted by political or media considerations, making her observations uniquely credible. Charlotte's revelations do more than recast a single incident. They provide insight into the emotional ecosystem of the royal family. They reveal how power dynamics, subtle pressure, and unspoken expectations shape relationships. They show how behavior, even when carefully hidden from cameras, impacts the most vulnerable in the room. And they illustrate how children, often dismissed as passive observers, can perceive and articulate truths that adults either overlook or misrepresent. By the end of the morning, Charlotte had not only understood what had happened, she had internalized it, processed it, and prepared to act in a way that would later redefine the narrative. Her observations of Meghan's subtle bullying, her mother's emotional response, and the overall tension in the room laid the groundwork for revelations that would shock the palace and the public alike. But just when it seemed that Charlotte's quiet observations had reached their peak significance, she would witness something even more astonishing, a moment that crystallized the power imbalance and would ultimately provide the clearest evidence of what she had been trying to communicate all along. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a mother in the middle of a high-pressure environment, where every decision, every glance, and every word is being scrutinized, not just by the world, but by someone whose behavior can subtly destabilize you? That was Kate Middleton that morning, caught between maintaining composure and managing the emotional ripples caused by Meghan Markle. And Princess Charlotte, sharp-eyed and observant, saw it all unfold. The incident that morning started innocuously enough, a minor issue with Charlotte's bridesmaid dress. The dress, hand-picked and meticulously prepared, didn't fit as expected. While most parents would have adjusted it with a few pins or a quick alteration, the royal environment added layers of stress that made the situation far more charged. Timing was tight, expectations were high, and everyone knew the world was watching, even in the private spaces behind palace doors. Meghan, focused on the precision of the ceremony and the appearance of her wedding party, began making subtle suggestions and corrections to the children's attire. Charlotte noticed that her tone, though polite, carried an edge, an undercurrent of pressure that seemed disproportionate to the issue at hand. The words themselves were not harsh, but they were delivered with a firmness that suggested control, expectation, and an insistence that things be done exactly her way. Kate, for her part, tried to manage the situation with patience. She attempted to mediate between Meghan's expectations and the practical limitations of a child's dress. She adjusted hems, straightened ribbons, and offered quiet reassurances to Charlotte, all while absorbing the tension in the room. But Meghan's subtle pressure continued, a series of small gestures and words that compounded into an emotional strain. And it was in that moment, under layers of expectation and subtle judgment, that Kate's composure began to crack. Charlotte, ever observant, noticed the first signs. A slight droop of her mother's shoulders. A brief pause in her movements as she tried to maintain control. The quick blink that seemed to hold back tears. Charlotte felt it in her own chest. The sudden tightness, the tension of the moment, the awareness that her mother was struggling emotionally. She understood instinctively that these were tears born not of weakness, but of pressure, frustration, and the complex dynamics of the room. This moment is significant because it highlights a truth often overlooked in public narratives. Emotions are contagious, and subtle forms of manipulation or pressure can have profound effects. Meghan's insistence on control, the exactness of the children's appearance, and the constant monitoring created an environment where Kate, despite her composure and experience, was emotionally impacted. Charlotte's perspective captures the depth of this impact in a way no public account has, because she saw the micro-moments, the subtle shifts, and the emotional undercurrents. Charlotte also recognized something crucial. The tension was not a simple misunderstanding. It was indicative of a larger pattern of behavior, Meghan's subtle actions, whether intentional or unconscious, exerted pressure on those around her. And in a high-stakes environment like a royal wedding, even small moments can escalate emotionally. Kate's tears were the culmination of these pressures, magnified by the weight of expectation, the presence of cameras, and the awareness that every gesture could be scrutinized. Consider the emotional landscape for a moment. Kate had to manage her children, maintain her composure, and navigate Meghan's expectations, all simultaneously. She was acutely aware of the public eye, the staff observing, and the delicate balance required to keep the wedding running smoothly. In this context, a small emotional crack, a single tear, a quick sniffle, was not a failure but a human response to extraordinary pressure. And Charlotte, watching and absorbing, understood this fully. Charlotte's observations also revealed the nuanced interplay of power and emotion. Meghan's subtle pressure placed Kate in a position where she had to navigate conflicting priorities, satisfy Meghan's expectations, maintain her own composure, and care for her children. This triangulation of tension created a complex emotional environment that Charlotte, with her keen perception, identified immediately. She noticed that the tears were not about conflict with Meghan per se, but about the emotional weight of managing multiple responsibilities under scrutiny. What makes this revelation critical is that it reframes the story of that morning. The media had long portrayed Kate as having caused Meghan distress. Meghan's interviews and public statements reinforced this narrative. But Charlotte's perspective flips it entirely. She observed the emotional reality. It was Meghan's subtle actions that placed undue pressure on Kate, and it was Kate's natural, human response to that pressure that resulted in tears. The child's eyes, free from bias or personal agenda, revealed a truth that adults had either overlooked or misrepresented. And there's another layer: Charlotte's empathy. She didn't just observe her mother's tears, she internalized them. She felt the tension, understood the imbalance, and began to form a perspective on fairness, emotional responsibility, and the dynamics of adult relationships. Even at 7 years old, she could recognize when behavior was unjust, and she could articulate it in a way that adults, constrained by ego and reputation, could not. As the morning progressed, the tension continued to ripple through the room. Every instruction from Meghan, every small critique, added another layer of emotional complexity. Kate maintained her composure as best she could, but Charlotte noticed the quiet moments of strain, the way her mother would pause, the subtle trembling of her hands, the fleeting expressions that revealed her inner struggle. It was in these moments that Charlotte's understanding deepened. She realized that subtle bullying isn't always obvious. It can be quiet, almost invisible, yet profoundly impactful. Charlotte's observations didn't stop there. She also noticed how her mother tried to shield her from the emotional weight of the situation. Kate maintained calm outwardly, gently guiding Charlotte and the other children, adjusting their dresses, and offering encouragement. In doing so, Kate absorbed the brunt of the emotional strain, protecting the children while silently enduring her own distress. Charlotte recognized this protective instinct, noting that her mother's tears were both a human response and a selfless act of care. And it was this understanding, the combination of observation, empathy, and interpretation, that would later form the basis of Charlotte's revelation to the family. She could articulate, with clarity and emotional precision, what had truly happened that morning. Not through gossip, rumor, or assumption, but through direct observation of behavior, emotional reaction, and subtle interaction. Her perspective was undeniable, credible, and profoundly illuminating. But just when it seemed the emotional impact of the bridesmaid dress had run its course, Charlotte witnessed an even more revealing moment, one that exposed the full extent of Meghan Markle's subtle bullying and its consequences. This moment would not only clarify the events of that morning, but also provide the clearest evidence of why her mother's tears were justified and why the public narrative had been so distorted. Have you ever witnessed a conversation so charged, so subtle yet explosive, that it could redefine everything you thought you knew about a situation? Princess Charlotte did. That morning, in the hushed, tension-filled corridors of the palace, she observed an exchange between Meghan Markle and her mother, Kate Middleton, that revealed the emotional dynamics in stark, undeniable clarity. It was not a shouting match, not a public confrontation, but it was a defining moment, one that exposed the underlying tension and emotional power play in a way no outside observer could have predicted. The exchange began over a seemingly minor point, the bridesmaid dress. Meghan, meticulous and exacting, suggested adjustments and corrections, not in a harsh voice, but with a firmness that implied expectation. Kate, ever composed, responded with patience, offering practical solutions and guidance. At first glance, it appeared routine, a mother and a new family member coordinating under the pressure of a royal wedding. But Charlotte, observing closely, noticed the microdynamics beneath the polite exterior. Every gesture mattered. The tilt of Meghan's head, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the barely perceptible sighs, they were all cues of subtle control. Kate's responses were equally telling, measured, calm, but tinged with quiet strain. Charlotte noticed the